Welcome to your Literature Genres podcast. In this podcast, you'll learn everything you need to know about literature genres that you'll be reading this year. First, let's start with the question, what is literature? Literature is any type or style of writing or book. Where can you find literature in this classroom? Did you think of all the books on the bookshelf? What about the teacher's books? How many people thought about their textbooks? Do you have any books in your book bag? What about in your desk? How many people thought about newspapers or magazines? These are all different kinds of literature. A second question is, what is a genre? A genre is a specific kind of style of writing. What kind of writing or type of book do you like to read? Do you like stories that happened in the past? Do you like stories that could actually happen? Do you like stories about magic? All of these are different genres. We'll be studying each of these in depth in the coming weeks. There are three main categories of literature. Fiction, which is not true. Fiction is false. There's nonfiction, which is true. And there's poetry. There are several genres of fiction we'll be studying. They are realistic fiction, historical fiction, science fiction, fantasy, folk tales, fairy tales, and mystery. There are two main types of nonfiction, informational and biographies. We'll also talk about poetry. Poetry doesn't have a genre underneath it because poetry is its own thing. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Let's start with fiction stories. Remember, fiction is false. That means that these stories are not true. The first type of fiction we're going to talk about is realistic fiction. Realistic fiction is fiction that could be real or could actually happen. These stories are make-believe, but have real characters doing real things in real ways. These are stories about people just like you. They could be stories about kids doing things that kids in Wagner do. When you're reading realistic fiction, some hints that tell you that it is realistic are that the story could actually happen to someone like you. If it could happen, it's realistic fiction. Historical fiction is a make-believe story that is set in the past. That means it's set long ago. The setting, the timing, even some of the characters may have been real, but the story or the plot is made up. So if George Washington is having a meeting and the plot tells all of the things he said or did, it's probably a fiction story, as no one really knows all of the things that George Washington did. The Magic Treehouse books are good examples of historical fiction. Jack and Annie go back in time to visit all of these people in the past, but it didn't really happen, therefore it's still historical fiction. When you read historical fiction, remember it'll be set in the past, and there may be people that you've learned about in social studies in the story. Science fiction are stories that use technology, outer space, or futuristic settings to tell a story. That means often science fiction stories happen in the future. They haven't happened yet. Sometimes they sound like they might someday be true, but they haven't happened yet. You can almost always tell you're reading a science fiction story if it has to do with aliens, outer space, technology that you've never heard of, happens in the future, superheroes, or robots. These are all giveaways that you're reading a science fiction book. Fantasy stories are completely make-believe with settings, characters, and/or plots that could never, ever happen. Many children's books are fantasies. The biggest hint for a fantasy book is talking animals, magic, and new worlds. So any story you can think of where the main character is an animal is a fantasy story. They could never happen. Folk tales are stories that have been passed down from generation to generation, from parent to child for a long time. Then somebody finally wrote them down. They often have the same elements as a fantasy story. There are many types of folk tales, the most popular being fairy tales. There are also myths, legends, and tall tales. If your story starts with once upon a time, chances are it's a folk tale. The last type of fiction we're going to read this year are mysteries. Mysteries are stories that revolve a problem that needs solving. They often are full of suspense and may have crimes that need solving. To be suspenseful, it means that you want to know what happens next. You can't wait to find out if they figure it out. You're reading a mystery if the story involves a crime, detectives, suspects, problem solving, or following clues. Think about these things as you read a mystery story. Let's talk for a few minutes about nonfiction. Remember, nonfiction are stories that are true. The first type of nonfiction is informational. Informational texts are true books that give facts and information. Textbooks are informational books. Remember, informational books give you information, and it's information that can be proven as true. A hint that you're reading an informational text would be a book full of facts and data. It would often have photographs instead of illustrations, and the information in the book can be proven. Biographies are another kind of nonfiction. Biographies are true stories about real people written by other people. They are factual. Everything in the story can be proven. Autobiographies are true stories about real people written by themselves. So, for instance, if President Obama wanted to write his story someday, he would write an autobiography about himself. Hints that you're reading a biography are that the story is full of facts about a real person's life. There are usually photographs, and all of the information in the story can be proven because it is true. Poetry is the last kind of literature that we're going to talk about. Poetry can be written in any way, shape, or form. It often has rhyme, which means the words end with the same sound, or rhythm, which means it has a beat. It is not always punctuated or capitalized. It is usually not a narrative. That means it's not a story. It has shorter sentences and no paragraphs. Instead of being called sentences and paragraphs, they're called lines and stanzas. Poetry can be about any topic, both fiction and nonfiction, which is why poetry is its own thing.